My parents were great storytellers. I loved the one about how they got married. They decided to elope on Christmas Day. My mom had just turned 17 years old, and they had to cross the state line to Arkansas, where the legal age to get married was 16. They left southern Missouri, Ava, Missouri, and ended up in Mountain Home, Arkansas. And as you might well guess, on Christmas Day, nothing was open except for the post office. There were people lined up outside the post office. They approached the line, and within a minute, everyone knew about this young couple that wanted to get married. Several of these people followed them to the judge's house, and the rest is history. The only picture of my parents' wedding is the judge and his family on one side of the Christmas tree, my parents in the middle, and on the bride's side are these random people from Mountain Home, Arkansas. They didn't know a soul. The follow-up story that my dad always told, much to the chagrin of my mom, was the fact that they got back to Ava, Missouri, back to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom's house. And she wouldn't let them sleep together until the marriage certificate arrived in the mail about a week later. Right before winter, right after the semester was over, winter break of my freshman year in college, 3 buddies of mine and I headed to northern Minnesota on an adventure. What we didn't realize at the time was that the adventure was going to happen on the trip home. What we didn't know was that the largest storm, winter storm of the last 50 years was in our path. We headed south out of Minneapolis. The snow got deeper and heavier. You might even say it was delusional snow. We got to Belmont, Iowa, and they closed the road, closed the interstate. We followed this snowplow off of the road, ended up in a truck stop with about 100 other people in Belmont, Iowa. Nobody knew what was going to happen to us until they opened the road again. Somehow or other, we met the minister of the Belmont, Iowa Church of God, and he took about 20 of us, and for the next 4 days, we lived in this church in Belmont, Iowa, as the snow continued to pile up, and it was quite a storm. We also met a lot of the parishioners. You see, it was the parishioners that marched through these deep snow drifts 3 times a day to make sure that we were fed. The town ran out of food, but we were taken care of and were fed very well until the road was open. My mother was always difficult to buy for. She was a very selfless person. She didn't want anything. When I was in high school, though, I convinced her to tell me what she wanted for Christmas. What she wanted was a necklace with a simple gold cross. I'd always worked, and I had a little bit of money saved up. So I headed to Metcalf South Shopping Center. There was a jewelry store there, owned by a little Jewish man, and he happened to be the one that waited on me, and I knew who he was because he did his own advertising with his picture in the Kansas City Star, print advertising. I explained to him that my mom wanted the gold cross, and he showed me all of these fine samples of his beautiful crosses on necklaces. At some point, I realized that I didn't have nearly as much money as any of his necklaces were going to cost. He asked me, "How much money do you have?" And I said, $17 and some change. And then he asked, "Which one of these necklaces do you think your mom would want?" And I said, well, I knew which one I thought she would want, and it was this little necklace with a real diamond right in the middle of the cross. He turned over the tag, $85. And he said, "Today I'll sell it to you for $17 and some change." I started to back off because I just knew this wasn't right. He saw this, and in kind of a expanded Yiddish that I can't even come close to saying, He said, "Hey, we're busy here. What, you want me to sell this to the next guy for $17 and some change?" As it happened, it was the best Christmas present I ever gave my mom. The last story, I was headed back to K-State right before Christmas break. It was a cold winter day. It was a Sunday afternoon during the day. West of Topeka on I-70, at the on-ramp was a couple that was hitchhiking. It was bitter cold. The wind chill had to be below zero, and I could tell that they weren't going to make it out there on the highway. I stopped the car. I backed up. The young man got in the back, and his partner got in the front seat. She looked like she was on the verge of frostbite. I cranked up the heater to my car as high as it would go, and as she began to thaw out, she started to shake uncontrollably, and my Boy Scout training kicked in, and I came to the conclusion that she was probably suffering from what might be hypothermia, and that this external heat wasn't going to help. She needed internal fluids. My mom, bless her heart, had always sent with me when I would leave for a road trip a thermos of something. This time it was soup and a couple of sandwiches and an apple. And I stopped the car. I gave them the soup and made sure that they started to get warmed up, and the sandwiches and the apple. And the fella in the back seat pulls out a pocket knife and starts to carve up the apple. I recognized the pocket knife. It was an Imperial Schrade Fisherman, just like my dad had carried with him all of his life. And we had this conversation about how my dad would sand down that blade, would file down that blade until there was nothing left to it. They headed up. They were going to Salina, Kansas. I was going to Manhattan. If you know your geography, it's about 60 miles on the other side of Manhattan, and there was no way I was going to drop them off at the Manhattan exit. And so I took them to Salina. They thanked me profusely. They didn't have anything to give, and I wouldn't have taken any money anyway. Fast forward about 4 months, and I'm cleaning out the back of my car. And in between the seats, I find this pocket knife, this very pocket knife. Now, I'll never know whether the young man wanted to give me this pocket knife or if it just slipped out of his pocket. But I've held on to it for the next 45 years, and I've always had this on my dresser as a reminder of that day. These stories, I think what they have in common is that they involve random acts of kindness toward complete strangers, people that we may never see again, that don't mean anything in our lives. If you know me well, sometimes you realize that I get on these tirades about how I think as a society we have lost our civility, especially in the last couple of years, last 10, 15 years. We have become less civil to each other, especially to strangers, people that we don't know. And maybe it's because we are packed in tighter together. It used to be that a stranger was a friend that you hadn't met yet, and today we teach our children stranger danger. Maybe it's because we spend more time on our computers communicating than we do face to face. Maybe it's because we're more tribal than we ever were before, and if you don't look like me and think like me and act like me, then you mean nothing to me. And as I get into this depth of cynicism, I think to myself, and I think back to a judge in a little town in Mountain Home, Arkansas, and a whole bunch of townspeople that wanted to witness a Christmas wedding. And I think of a preacher in northern Iowa who gathered his flock together to make sure some surprise guests got fed. Or maybe a jeweler in Kansas that didn't even celebrate Christmas himself, but understood the value of Christmas between a boy and his mom. Random acts of kindness don't cost anything, but they do require some awareness and something on your part that some incentive, some motion on the individual's part. But the blessing that the person that gives this random act of kindness is truly something that can last you the rest of your life. Besides that, it makes a very interesting family story. Thank you.